After 4 years of a Trump administration which aligned itself so closely to Israel's interests, Israelis and Palestinians alike are preparing for a new course under Biden. That means cautious hope on one side and concern on the other. Let's start with the concerned party, the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Donald Trump was its great benefactor, bestowing the declaration of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, moving the US embassy there, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, delivering a Trump plan that envisaged annexing 30% of the occupied West Bank and sovereignty over almost all of East Jerusalem. And then, in its final months, normalization deals with the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. The question is how much of this is a permanent change of the regional game, as the outgoing Trump team regularly insists, and how much might be unpicked by a new US administration with a very different policy agenda. We've seen Netanyahu, who above all else has an upcoming election to worry about, try to push through as much as possible in terms of settlement activity before the inauguration of a president who will almost certainly oppose it. Both a material gain as far as a section of his voters on the Israeli right are concerned, and a signal of defiance to the incoming Biden team. On Iran, there's been close coordination with the Trump administration to put obstacles in the way of any efforts to return to the nuclear deal. But there are several things Biden could do that would at least start to tilt the balance away from the Israeli side. He could allow the Palestine Liberation Organization to reopen its representative office in Washington after it was shut down under Trump. He could restore the US consulate in Jerusalem, essentially its diplomatic mission to the Palestinians. And there's an interesting set of options around the Israeli-Arab normalization deals. Netanyahu presents them as done deals, cost-free in terms of any concessions to the Palestinians. That leaves out what was given up, any short-term ambitions to annex parts of the West Bank. Certainly, the Biden team has shown support for normalization, but it could, in return for sponsoring a deepening of those ties and expanding them to other Arab nations, start to require incremental Israeli concessions to the Palestinians. That, though, would require a major shift in the Palestinian position, that normalization must come after a resolution of the conflict with Israel, not as part of the process. That has been a principle adhered to for nearly 20 years. They accuse the states who've gone ahead with normalization of stabbing them in the back. So, what of the Palestinian attitude to Biden? Before the election, some senior officials maintained that the US had lost its legitimacy and its role under Trump, that they weren't simply pinning their hopes on a Biden win, that they would look elsewhere in the world for leadership on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Well, it hasn't quite looked that way since the November election. We've seen the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas drive a shift in the policy of payments to Palestinian prisoners and their families, deeply opposed in the US as well as Israel, where it's become known as pay for slay. And this month there's been the announcement of dates for Palestinian legislative and presidential elections, the first for 15 years. At least a signal to Biden that the Palestinian president is trying to heal the rifts with Hamas in Gaza. However unlikely that still seems to many. A return to a more familiar style of US engagement may not seem an enormous prize given the stalled process and continued settlement expansion that preceded Trump. But 4 years later, it's what's on the table, and the Palestinians are keen to maximize whatever benefits they can.